Hey, folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I am joined today by the Lord Otter, who is the author of Curse of the Star Wraiths, a novel in the Steel and Stormbright series, the first novel, in fact. And I'm here to interview him today. He's an interesting fellow, and he's got a fun story to read. So, Lord Otter, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience who may not have heard of you yet?
Hello, hello. I'm the Lord Otter. I am a fantasy and science fiction author. The Curse of the Star Wraiths is my debut novel, and I'm hoping for that to be the first in an ongoing series of Sword and Sandal, Swords and Sorcery.
All right. So let's get right into it. Your novel is The Curse of the Star Race. People can see the cover right there. It gives you a pretty good sense, actually. One of the things I like about Neutron Bohr, your cover artist, is he has a real knack for giving a sense of a world and the characters in a single shot. A lot of covers give you one or the other, but he's pretty good at nailing both. So tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, so The Curse of the Star Raids is a tale of brotherhood and perseverance. It is first and foremost a swords and sorcery tale, but it also has a bit of seinen influence as well. A lot of anime and manga as well. But it's very much kind of like set in this sword and sandal world where the this golden empire named Alcaron is kind of conquering the surrounding lands, and humanity is kind of like one of the primary targets in their way. So we follow our two main characters who start out as Serathis and Zolan as they kind of come in contact with the villain General Kerst and sort of the larger government body that she really kind of like represents. She is like a military general, an esteemed falconer, but yeah, it's very much kind of like high fantasy, weird magic, pretty much just like quick pace, fun adventure. That's the whole kind of like focus of the story.
Okay, well, you really fanned the hammer there because I have a bunch of things I'm interested in asking about. Just going off that, but let's start with sword and sandal. Why did you choose that particular genre as opposed to all the other ones out there?
Yeah, and this is kind of the thing. I'm sort of like a big tabletop RPG player myself. I DM regularly, but I've kind of seen sort of like the field. Medieval fantasy is very huge right now, to the point where it's a little oversaturated, in my personal opinion. So I sort of wanted something that's a little more low fantasy, something that's more along the lines of kind of like Conan, but not quite along, not completely. So I sort of took a bit of influence from that, and also Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser was a major, major influence. And I really like sort of like how whimsical that world felt, and pairing that with more of a classical historical setting with sort of like a bit of influence from like ancient Roman times, a little bit of Celtic. For me, it just seemed kind of like a natural fit. It was a very interesting idea that just kind of spawned stories.
Okay, um, you're one of the things that struck me as I was reading your book is that, and you just mentioned this in your intro as well. So I let's dig into this a little bit. You mentioned that the Golden Empire um, is not human, but they look and they appear human. Why did you choose to go that route instead of like having them be orcs or even elves or something more distant from humanity?
Right. So one of the fun things about the world, especially with the Elgrathian race, I want them to be sort of like human-like in appearance. They're in their physical anatomy and everything. They're almost sort of like the very embodiment of heroes of legend. I really wanted to kind of hammer home that almost angelic look and feel to them. But once you delve a bit more into who they actually are, what they believe in, and what their goal is, it's almost kind of like that's subverted. So without it going into full on dark fantasy or grim dark, I wanted to put a spin on that sort of classic heroic trope without completely flipping on its head, because this is a tale of heroism and rising up to the challenge.
All right, that's a fair approach. Um, were you at all concerned that you might be adding like they almost feel like an Ubermensch. Were you concerned about having any of those kind of overtones in your story? Did you do anything to purposely avoid it? Because I think you did do a good job of avoiding it. I was worried that was going to be a trope in the first, 20 pages or so, but it didn't really play out that way. Did you have that in mind while you were writing?
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of avoid it being a strict allegory or anything like that. I mean, I can sort of like make a few comparisons in the real world of what the whole Empire of Alcaron sort of feels like, what the Ograthians kind of remind me of. But I also wanted it to be sort of like you can each reader can sort of like interpret it differently. I did not want it to just be like, this is my strict intent. For me, that kind of ages a book in some ways if mishandled. And for me, I wanted something that can easily connect and remove trying to distance myself from that whole allegory side of it. It just felt a lot more right to me. And I didn't really want that to be the focus of it either, because a lot of Iron Age literature, a lot of new up and coming indie projects. A lot of it is sort of like a response to overwhelming politics, getting into media. And for me, part of that is answering that by just having a simple story. Yeah, there's more of a thematic undertone going on, but I do not want to try and connect it to current day politics, if that makes any sense.
Sure. Yeah. No, I like what you did with it. Um, it is it was refreshing because yeah, we do get a lot of that kind of thing, kind of thrown in there. And I prefer, I don't have a direct problem with it, but I had a English professor when I was in college who said, after you get cheesecake, even if you really love cheesecake, if after you eat it 100 times, maybe you're kind of like, can I just get some cornbread? And and I definitely feel like entertainment, especially, can wind up that way. You mentioned weird magic as well, so I figured this guy is a good place to start with this. This is a storm god, according to your story, and I thought it was interesting that you just have these um, incarnations and deities show up randomly, almost it seems, in your story. What made you want to build a world where like you can just stumble across these entities? Was it the sense of mystery, or did you almost want to um, was it more about destiny or something like that? I think it's a very interesting element, but you can read it in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and it started out in a few different ways too, and it kind of evolved over time because in earlier incarnations of the story, this was more of a chosen one plot line, but it kind of shifted gears from there into something that's a little more open-ended. And with the how the gods actually have a place in the world, I wanted to have it be more of kind of like a dreamlike element that you could easily kind of like distinguish from the harsher parts of what Steel and Stormbright have to go through, especially early on in the story. It's kind of like you're floating among the clouds 1 second, and then the very next, it's like some of the roughest parts of their lives are like right after. So for me, that contrast is a big thing too. I mean, if we're writing fantasy, I want to have something that feels a little weirder, just almost sort of dreamlike in that sense. That was kind of the overall effect I was wanting to go for.
Sure. Yeah, I did like your introduction, which is where this guy shows up. I'm afraid his name has escaped me, but it's a very memorable scene, and it does have that very different quality to it. Um,
Yeah, and another big part of the story for me at least is I kind of wanted Payne to sort of be a tutor for the two brothers throughout the story. It's like, yeah, there some of the scenes are very harsh on them and some of the other characters for that matter, but it's a matter of pushing through it, taking some of those tougher moments in life and learning how to become a better person. Because I I don't know how many stories you've seen where it's like a tragedy can just completely ruin a character and that's the end of the story. For me, that's kind of a trope that I've sort of grown tired of over the years.
Hmm.
I wanted to try and invert it. So it's a tragedy that ends up becoming into something a lot more optimistic by the end. That was kind of the idea behind it.
Yeah. So you also, outside of like the dreamlike quality of magic, you also have some more practical applications of magic. Um, One that really stood out to me was this one, where you have this city defended by like these great, magical devices. And when you said weird magic, this was actually the first thing I thought of.
Yeah,
Um, and this is kind of like, this is not like cutting edge magic science either. Like this is a relic from almost from a lost civilization. So why did you choose to do that? Like there are a lot of fantasies where like magic is from outside or magic is a cutting edge thing. Why did you choose to have magic be this really old relic instead of some of those other approaches?
right. And I mean, don't get me wrong, certain implementations of magic in other book series, like where it's a bit more science, like that's fine in its own right. But especially this, especially how I tackle magic here, I wanted it to be sort of like this element of almost controlled chaos. There is a certain element of predictability to it, but there's also a certain part of it where it's just completely outside of the world's control. In a certain way, it's very much like a tug and pull. So for like the star towers here, basically, it kind of feeds back into that overall feeling of like at one point it feels like it could be anything's possible, and then it cuts back to harsh reality, which is this is a time of war. There is magic in the setting, but even then, it's not fully understood. Maybe at one point it was, but perhaps not for long. Maybe it's even changed since then. That that's kind of like the idea, and I love it whenever that's done very well in fantasy. You see it in certain sagas like Berserk. I really like how it's done there. You even see it a bit in some older series, which I really like. Lord Dunsany, for example, is a phenomenal example of giving the world nature and magic sort of like this uh, element of mystery, element of personification. For me, it's just a really fascinating way to take it, and I really wanted to lean into that.
Okay, and you have airships in your setting as well. And one thing
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about, since you say, especially after you've answered that question, I was not entirely clear, and maybe I just missed it. I wasn't clear if those were magic or technology. So um, I don't know if you want to answer that question directly, or you could just say whether your setting has that kind of technology.
Yeah, so it's about as close as the actual magic in this setting comes to sort of like a half-formed science. It's still not fully predictable, but the whole kingdom of Divnarost at one point, they were actual masters of kind of like honing magic. Probably the best comparison is sort of like Magitech. It's harnessing the chaotic effects of magic in this world to a more kind of like uh, a more purposeful design. And the airship is a big example of that. There's whole islands floating in the sky, sort of like as a monument of what magicians and sorcerers in this world can do. And a long time ago, they were capable of doing it. But as as chaotic and mysterious as magic is in this world, a lot of that can either fall into decay, it can go out of control. So that was kind of the idea anyway.
Okay, yeah. Again, I think it is interesting that like a lot of the big works of magic are like these relics of a lost civilization. Kind of tickles the Indiana Jones vibe a little bit.
Yeah, and I wanted to lean a little bit into sort of like the whole Atlantis myth, especially with the whole Divnarost kingdom. There's quite a few sort of like nods to like the lost kingdom of Atlantis. So yeah, quite a bit there.
Okay, so we've talked about the world some. Let's talk about your characters, Steel and Stormbright, as they are known for most of the tale. What was your? Did you have a particular inspiration for them, or were you just trying to write, a pair of interesting brothers?
Well, there's actually a couple of different inspirations that I had for them. For one, I've kind of said this before. It was right around the beginning of this time that I was reading through a lot of the older Fawford and Grey Mauser stories, and I loved the dynamic between the two characters in that. It was very much kind of like buddy cop fantasy. I love that one was kind of like this very stern barbarian. The other was more of kind of like a sly thief. I love the back and forth and how you could kind of see both of them, how their whole relationship would change over time. It would like crisscross, divide. You'd see how how one of them, like Fawford, is up here doing this, and somehow it ties back into the Grey Mouser doing this on the other side of like the world sometimes. And for me, it was taking that and applying it to a more direct connection of them being brothers. So they're like sort of like yin and yang. One is a bit more active in how he approaches everything. He's a bit more cocky, wisecracking, and he's the thief, mind you. Whereas the other is a lot more studious. He's listening and insightful, but he's timid as well. So I like the idea of them playing off of each other, and in that way, you get to see two whole different perspectives of how the world kind of like interacts with them. Uh, One of them is kind of like stealing through the streets, trying to like nick things as much as he can, whereas the other is trying to like learn the very fabric of magic, trying to figure out more of what's going on in the world and how it actually works. So I love that whole perspective. For me, that's something that just even now it's like you can make so many stories from that idea alone. And it's not I'm not just talking about my two characters. A lot of buddy cop stories, they kind of give that sort of opportunity for fun adventures like that.
Yeah, yeah. I was actually wondering if you had any particular set of buddy cops in mind in particular, because there is kind of that dynamic between them. One of them is I don't know if I would describe Stormbright as by the book, but he is very much looking for like that chain of logic. Very studious, as you said, and then his brother is uh, a little more by the seat of his pants.
Yeah, and it's exactly it's for the reason that Stormbright is more of a magician that my how magic is done in this world, it's not completely random. It's not exactly like Gandalf where he casts a spell and you just kind of go along with it. There's a few hard edges to how magic works in this, so you know what he's capable of doing and where it kind of stops. I wanted to make sure that was a factor because if you give a character fun powers, you want to be sure to kind of let the reader know, okay, this is where they can't go any further. This is like their limit. And it doesn't have to be complicated either. For me, it's as simple as, oh, he gets tired after doing this for a certain amount of time. So he can't
Right.
go any farther than that.
I thought it was interesting too. I'm not I'm not an expert on the sword and sandal genre, but I thought it was interesting you chose to have a magic user be one of your main characters because that's not typical of the genre as I understand it.
Yeah, and I can see why because it's very easy to have sort of like a mage as your main character, and if you're really trying to dig into their whole thought process while learning how to do magic, you've got to explain magic to a certain degree. I'm sure that's a bit of a tightrope to walk there without over explaining how your whole magic system at that point, which is really something I didn't want to do. I wanted to try and keep it as simple as possible to comprehend. Very much the idea that the surface events of the story you could follow along and just enjoy in its own right, but there's kind of like this second layer underneath where it's like this is the actual ideas that's being discussed. I wanted it to work on those two different levels. That was kind of a similar philosophy I had with the magic. It's like simple to understand, but there's deeper implications into how it fits with the greater world.
Okay. And I noticed too there's a lot of different, I don't know if schools is the right magic, but there's a lot of different ways people think about magic, if nothing else.
Yeah, and there are different quote unquote schools, and certain magicians can even kind of like dabble into other schools, but a lot of the idea is kind of like it's very much linked to sort of like your own inner discipline, your capacity to kind of like control your own thought process and emotions, and a lot of it is kind of like channeling your own mind and consciousness into the world around you, which kind of feeds back into the whole dream, in a
Hmm.
sense. So it's very much kind of like your mind has an effect on reality, which I'm hoping to expand on in later books, actually. Sort of like just how magic can affect reality around you. It's dealt with a little bit here, but not to the full extent that I want to.
Yeah. Speaking of expanding, one of the things I I found myself thinking a couple of times over the course of your book, oh, we've added a new main character to the cast. And then they were gone by, in another couple of chapters, which is, a fine approach to storytelling. But is it your intention to keep the story firmly focused on just the brothers, or do you think you will expand your cast as time goes on?
Right, and that's part of the thing. For the moment, I'm kind of keeping it centered around the brothers, but I have thought about that in the past of bringing a different perspective into the mix. I've sort of done that a little bit with this book with General Karst and a few other characters. That's part of why I took more of an omniscient perspective. But yeah, especially in the future, I've been kind of toying around with the idea of doing a spin-off series in this world because there is a lot to explore. Where I'm thinking I have this story and this story in mind, but there's all this over here that I know what's going on, but I can't deal with it right now. So having a spin-off or just a different set of characters to really help kind of flesh everything out. Yeah, it's been on my mind for a while, and I don't know exactly how I'm gonna do it, but it's something that I know I want to have down the road.
Sure. So when you're putting a story together, you have this broad, expansive world with some very interesting concepts in it, and you have some character dynamics laid out. Do you start from the point of view that I have characters who want to do these specific things, or do you start with the point of view of there are things happening in the world, and it's going to challenge my characters in these ways? What's your approach?
Right, and I sort of go more with the latter approach, though the overall characters themselves is certainly a factor because there's certain things I know that I want the characters to kind of be challenged by just by being who they are. Sometimes I don't know exactly what's going to be happening in the world until I get to it and sort of like outlining, I especially drafting, but I tend to be a bit more plot focused in how I approach the story, which is I try to be careful with that though because if a character is wanting to act a certain way and how I plot it is different, I've got to listen to that because I that's one of the limits I've set for myself. Don't have the characters not be themselves because usually whenever they're being themselves, it is going to make your story better. It's just kind of finding that sweet spot of how it ties back in and just makes the whole thing a whole lot more rich.
Right, right. Yeah, I do find it a little strange because there are authors out there who are like, it's got to be entirely about your characters or it's entirely the plot. I'm like, it really when they gel together, that's the sweet spot. And I tend to start with events in the world too. But yeah, I think that you really do need to be like listening to both to find that really strong balance point.
Right, and it's definitely a tightrope to walk. That's a lot of, especially with this book, because I like this is probably something I don't recommend for a lot of beginning authors to do, especially with your first book, kind of introducing a dynamic between two characters. I know that for me, I had to go back to the drawing board several times to make sure that that felt natural, that each character voice was distinct. It was a challenge, but I'm very happy with where it ended up anyway. It was just it was a learning experience all the way around. Trying to find that balance between giving just enough of the world to make you feel intrigued without just overloading the reader with useless information they're not going to care about.
Yeah. Yeah, that's especially when you have a fantasy you've done a lot of world building for. It can be tough to find that sweet spot.
Yeah, it was a little tougher even considering I started with the setting before the story even came about. It was like I started building certain highlights of the world, and from there that's kind of when the story just sprang out of nowhere. It just kind of hit me one day. And I don't recommend that for every writer to do because there's that danger of, oh, I have this whole world. I want to share it with everybody, but you run the risk of sharing a lot of stuff the reader is just not going to care about.
So, with all this detailed world building, do you think you'll ever do a story in another genre?
Yeah,
Or
I'm actually planning on taking my cyberpunk setting I'm doing for tabletop at the moment and actually making a series of novels out of them.
okay,
That's actually Dark Augment. It's kind of a mix between cyberpunk, a little bit of post-apocalypse, and horror. So I kind of want to mix those elements, put them in a blender, see what fun things I can do with it. I'm sure that's going to be a whole tightrope walking challenge in itself, but I'm still excited to get there. It so far from what I've built of it and just kind of like the games I've ran, it's like more and more of the world itself is just kind of revealing itself, and I'm just thinking to myself, man, this one faction here or this certain set of characters, I know there's a story to them. I know there's more there. I want to kind of go forward with it.
cool, cool. All right. So I know that this book has been out for a couple of months. Do you have an idea when you might be launching a new project, or are you still very much putting things together on that one?
Yeah, I'm still in the process of putting things together. I'm currently in the process of writing up the second book as well as kind of like coming up with a whole outline for the Dark Augment project on the side. So it's a couple of different it's a couple of different novel ideas I want to sort of like have simultaneously as I'm going forward. So I end up I didn't really have much of a plan with this first novel, more kind of like learning the ropes as I went. Now that I've got this first one out, I feel like I've got a much better idea of what I want to do and what all kind of pitfalls are along the way. So by the time I finish another story, I can immediately go ahead and start polishing up the other. So working on at least two projects at once. And I've seen this from a lot of other writers that this is a method that works. So that's kind of
Mhm.
the approach I'm going with.
Have you ever thought about branching out into different mediums? I know we've seen Daniel P. Riley adapting one of his novels to a comic. Would you be interested in that, or maybe writing one of your own?
Yeah, I don't know the second thing about actually writing out a comic book script or paneling or anything like that, but I'd love to actually learn and figure out what would be the best way to kind of like come up with an adaptation because Steel and Stormbright would fit perfectly into kind of a comic book medium. I feel it's very much action focused. I wanted to keep it a tight pace, so I think that works perfectly for a comic book issue for sure.
Yeah, yeah. It would be I mean, any prose book translating it to a comic page is a very interesting challenge. But I think you do have a story that would be well suited to it.
Yeah, and I've noticed that not some books are translated into comic books easier than others. But one thing I've kind of found is if you have something that's a little more plot focused, a little more pulpy in nature, at least what I've seen in the past, those kind of translate the easiest into comic book projects. And thankfully, through a process of blood, sweat, and tears, I can say that I think mine would fit pretty well.
All right. Sounds pretty good. Well, thank you for coming, talking about your project. It's been very interesting picking your brain. And hopefully, we can have you back to talk again when you're working on your next project and have a little more to say about that.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been good talking to you. Well, folks, if you are interested in hearing more from the Lord Otter, he also has his own YouTube channel. You can find that at the Lord Otter. There will be a link down below. You can also find him at Downstream Pulp on Substack if you're interested in seeing what he writes there as well. I think you have some reviews there and some other stuff like that.
Yeah, I have quite a bit of reviews on there. I have a few short stories as well, along with some articles on either tabletop RPGs or something along those lines, topic of the week. Those are a little rare. A lot of it is reviews for latest Iron Age projects, indies, some traditional publishing as well.
All right, so be sure to check that stuff out. While you're down there, there's a like button and a subscribe button. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll be talking to you later.